Get on your knees and clean my shoes, sweeper. Richard's voice cracked across the site like a whip. The foundation math is wrong. It will collapse. Emma said it fast, breathless, kneeling in the mud already. You think a dirty sweeper knows more than an engineer? Richard snatched the blueprint from her hands and tore it into shreds. Please, sir, just look at the numbers. Emma reached for the torn pieces on the ground. Richard kicked a bucket of filthy mop water straight onto her only lunch. The water splashed across the bread, soaking it black. Nobody on the site said a word. Emma looked up once, calm, and said only 6 words. You'll regret not listening.
Wait a minute. He just fired a literal genius to protect his ego. Let's see how it started.
The morning air over the downtown site hung thick with cement dust, and Emma pushed her broom through it before the sun had fully cleared the cranes. She was 24, a site sweeper, her jacket patched at both elbows, her hands raw and cracked from months of cold water and rough bristles. Around her neck, she wore a thin silver chain, the only thing left from her mother worn smooth by years of touching. She kept sweeping. The site swallowed sound the way a throat swallows a stone, dull, heavy, endless. Trucks groaned. Rebar clanged against rebar. Somewhere above, a crane operator shouted numbers into a radio. Emma moved through all of it with her head down, gathering dust into small gray hills, because every hill meant another hour closer to her wage, and her wage meant another hour closer to the number she owed the hospital. She did not look at the number anymore. She only looked at the dirt. By the loading gate, Robert leaned against the chain-link fence in his guard uniform, watching her without meaning to. He was 51, a man who had spent 3 decades learning not to get involved. His eyes followed Emma's slow progress across the yard, and something in his jaw tightened, though his feet did not move. He had seen girls like her before. He told himself that was the reason he stayed still. Near the trailer marked Foreman, Richard stood over a folding table, blueprints spread beneath his palm like a hand of cards he already knew he'd won. He was 38 site foreman, his boots polished despite the mud, a gold watch catching the gray morning light every time he gestured. He liked being watched. He liked being right. When he saw Emma pause near the table, her broom stilled, her eyes drifting toward the paper, something in his chest went cold and then hot. Something interesting down there, he said. Emma straightened. No, sir, just sweeping. Funny. He walked toward her unhurried, each step deliberate on the packed dirt. Because it looked like you were reading. I wasn't reading anything, sir. He smiled without warmth, and with one boot he dragged a wide arc through her clean pile, scattering it back across the yard in a soft gray cloud. Dust settled on her sleeves, her collar, the toes of her shoes. She did not flinch. She did not speak. Better get back to work, Richard said, before I find a reason you shouldn't have one. He walked off, laughing to himself, already forgetting her, already certain the matter was closed. Robert watched the whole exchange from the gate. He watched Emma kneel in the settling dust without a word, gathering it again into a pile, patient, wordless, as if the humiliation weighed nothing at all. He wanted to say something. He said nothing. He turned his eyes toward the street instead, ashamed of the silence in his own throat. Emma knelt there a long moment after Richard's boots had faded past the trailers. The dust was fine beneath her fingers, cool, almost soft. She glanced once toward the folding table, toward the blueprint corner, still fluttering under a rusted clip, and something in her settled the way water settles once a stone stops moving through it. She had seen the numbers on that page for only 3 seconds. 3 seconds had been enough. She picked up a broken twig from the ground beside her broom. In the loose dirt at her knees, she began to draw. Not idle lines, not a child's doodle. A load calculation precise, the kind of figure that lived in engineering textbooks she'd once studied by lamplight before her mother's illness ended all of that. Symbols, fractions. A diagram of a support column with forces marked at each vector point. Her hand moved fast, sure the twigs scratching soft grooves into the packed earth, and for 1 small hour she was not a sweeper kneeling in dust. She was something else entirely, something the site had no name for. She finished the equation and sat back on her heels. The numbers on Richard's table were wrong, off by more than a margin of error, off in a way that would matter the day the concrete set, and never mattered again after. She stared at her own handwriting in the dirt, at the mistake she had just proven twice over, and her stomach turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. From the far side of the yard, past the fence, past the idle cement mixer, an old man in a torn coat stood watching her from the shadow of a support beam. He had been there for several minutes. He did not move. He only watched the way her hand had worked the twig, the way her eyes had narrowed at the final figure, the way she erased nothing corrected, nothing, because she hadn't needed to. Emma brushed the dirt from her equation with the side of her palm, quiet, careful. The way someone smooths a bruise they don't want anyone to notice. She had no way of knowing that the old man's eyes had already seen more of her than anyone on this site ever had, and no way of knowing that the numbers she had just drawn in the dirt, the ones nobody asked for and nobody wanted, were about to become the foundation of everything that came next. The brake horn sounded thin over the yard, and Emma found her usual spot behind a stack of concrete pipes where the wind couldn't reach her. She unwrapped the single piece of bread she'd carried since dawn, turning it once in her fingers before allowing herself the first bite. It was all she had until tomorrow. She had learned to make it last by eating slowly, by pretending there was more than there was. She heard the cough before she saw him. Near the gate, a man had collapsed against the fence post, his coat torn at both shoulders, his frame so thin the fabric seemed to hang from bone rather than flesh. He was old, or aged to look old, his beard matted with dust from the street, his breath coming in short gray puffs. He gripped the chain link with one shaking hand, trying to pull himself upright and failing and trying again. Robert saw him too from his post by the trailer and did not move. He had watched 100 men like this pass along the fence line over the years, and experience had taught him that helping one only invited 10 more. He kept his eyes on his clipboard. He told himself the beggar would move on the way they always did. Emma set down her bread. She crossed the yard without deciding to the way a hand reaches for a falling glass before the mind has finished registering the fall. She knelt beside the old man, and up close she could see the cracked skin at his lips, the hollow beneath his eyes, the way his hands trembled with something closer to starvation than cold. "Sir, can you hear me?" He lifted his head, and his eyes, she noticed, were sharper than the rest of him. Too sharp. She didn't have time to wonder why. She broke her bread in half and pressed it into his palm. "Eat," she said, slowly. He stared at the bread for a long moment, as though it were a stranger to him, as though he had forgotten what a kindness looked like up close. Then he ate. He ate the way a starving man eats, without grace, without pretense, and Emma stayed kneeling beside him the whole time, her own stomach hollow and complaining, saying nothing about it. Robert watched from the fence, his jaw tight. He had expected her to walk past. Everyone walked past. He found himself gripping the clipboard harder than the moment required. When the old man finished the last of the bread, he wiped his mouth with the back of a shaking hand and looked at Emma for a long beat, studying her the way an inspector studies a beam before signing off on it. "You work here," he said. His voice was rough but steady beneath the roughness. "I sweep," Emma said. "Yes." "The east pillar," the old man said. "Foundation load. If the site engineer used a standard 4-point distribution model on soil like this, what would the safety margin be?" Emma blinked. It was not a question a beggar asked. It was not a question most foremen could answer, let alone a man dying of hunger against a fence post. She almost laughed, except something in his eyes stopped her, something patient and unblinking. She answered anyway. She always answered when the numbers were right there waiting. "Too thin," she said. "This soil doesn't compress evenly. There's clay under the east corner. I've watched the runoff after rain. A 4-point model would overestimate stability by a wide margin. You'd want at minimum a 6-point distribution, maybe deeper piles on the east side alone." The old man said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once, slow, as if confirming something he had already suspected and only needed to hear out loud. "Where did you learn that?" "Books," Emma said. "Before. It doesn't matter now." "It matters." the old man said so quietly she almost missed it. She helped him to his feet, and he stood straighter than his collapse against the fence had suggested he could, though he still leaned on her arm for balance as they crossed toward the gate. He thanked her in a voice too even for a man who had just been dying in the dirt and shuffled off down the street without looking back. Emma returned to her broom with an empty stomach and a strange unease she couldn't name. She told herself it didn't matter, that a starving man's questions were only the confusion of hunger, that she would forget him by evening. She did not know that the old man had already memorized every word she'd said, filing her exact terminology away like evidence in a case only he understood. She did not know that the true hunger driving him through that gate had nothing to do with bread at all, and everything to do with the truth he had just found kneeling in the dust, offering him her only meal without a second thought. The master blueprint sat open on Thomas's folding table when Emma passed with her cart of tools, left unattended for the length of a phone call he'd wandered off to take. She should have kept walking. She had learned by now exactly what happened when she didn't. She stopped anyway. The pages were pinned flat beneath the coffee-stained clipboard corners curling in the wind, and one sheet in particular caught her eye, the main support column diagram, the one she had already sketched from memory in the dirt 2 days before. She leaned closer just to check, just to be certain her own numbers hadn't been wrong. They weren't wrong. The column's angle was off, not by a careless degree, not by something a builder could shrug away, but by 4 full degrees from true vertical, a deviation buried under enough technical language that anyone skimming the page would miss it entirely. She traced the line with her eyes twice a third time, hoping each pass would prove her first read a mistake. It didn't. 4 degrees multiplied across the load the column would eventually bear meant the whole structure would lean into failure the moment enough weight settled onto it. Not someday, inevitably. Her hands had gone still on the cart handle. "What exactly?" a voice said behind her. "Do you think you're doing?" Thomas had returned faster than she'd expected, his phone still in one hand, his mocking grin already sliding into place before he'd even seen what she was looking at. He was the site's foreman in training, younger than Richard, hungrier for the same kind of power, and he snatched the blueprint sheet off the table before Emma could answer, folding it hard against his chest like she might steal it outright. "I wasn't—" "You were reading," Thomas said, like a sweeper, reading structural drawings. "There's an error," Emma said. "The support column, it's 4 degrees off vertical. If that gets poured into the foundation, the whole east side will carry an uneven load. It'll shift over time. It could nothing." Thomas laughed short and sharp, the kind of laugh meant to end a conversation rather than continue it. "You clean floors. You don't read blueprints. Please." Emma stepped closer despite the flush rising in her chest, despite every instinct telling her to let it go, to walk away, to keep her wage safe for 1 more week. "Just look at the math. It'll only take a minute. If people are working near that column when it fails—" "Are you threatening the site?" "I'm trying to save it." Thomas's grin thinned into something colder. He glanced past her toward the cluster of laborers near the mixer and lowered his voice like a man protecting a secret rather than a mistake. "Listen to me," he said. "I don't care if you memorized a textbook once. You touch these drawings again, you look at them again, even breathe near this table again. I go straight to Richard and you're done here. Do you understand me?" Emma held his gaze a moment longer than was wise. "The math doesn't care who reports it. Get back to your cart." She got back to her cart. She swept the same stretch of ground 3 times that afternoon, without registering a single motion of the broom, her mind circling the column's angle, the load calculations, the lives that would eventually stand beneath that beam without knowing what she knew. She thought of walking straight to Richard herself. She thought of the wage she couldn't lose. She thought of her mother's hospital bill, the number that grew a little every week, regardless of what Emma did or didn't say. By the end of her shift, word had already reached the foreman's trailer. She caught the way 2 other laborers glanced at her sideways as she passed, the way a supervisor near the gate made a small note on his clipboard without looking up. She'd become, in the space of 1 afternoon, a name attached to trouble a sweeper who couldn't keep her eyes on her own broom. Robert noticed the shift too, watching from his post as Emma walked past with her head down, her pace steadier than it should have been for someone who had just made herself a target. He didn't know what she'd seen on that table. He only knew the air around her had changed the way air changes before a storm nobody else has noticed the clouds for yet. That night, walking the long way home past the site's outer fence, Emma paused once at the gate and looked back at the skeleton of steel rising against the dark sky at the exact column she now knew was already doomed. She thought about how easy it would be to say nothing further, to let the concrete pour and the numbers fail on someone else's watch in someone else's future. She knew she wouldn't stay silent. She had never been built that way, not even when silence would have been so much safer. She didn't yet know that her refusal to look away from 4 degrees of error was about to cost her everything she had left to lose. The cement trucks arrived before sunrise, 6 of them in a slow convoy that rattled the fence line as they turned into the yard, their drums already churning with the mixture that would set the east foundation into permanent stone within the hour. Emma heard them before she saw them, the low grinding hum vibrating up through the soles of her shoes, and something in her chest tightened into a fist. There was no more time for quiet channels. She found Richard inside the site trailer, mid-meeting with 2 men in clean jackets she didn't recognize, investors or inspectors, she couldn't tell which. He stood at the head of the table, gesturing at a rendering of the finished tower, his voice smooth, with the kind of confidence that came from never once being questioned in a room like this. Emma knocked once and walked in anyway. "The pour can't happen yet," she said. Richard's head turned slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to fury in the space of a single breath. "Get out. The east support column is off by 4 degrees. If you pour now, it's permanent. Once it sets, there's no fixing it without tearing out the whole foundation." "I said get out. Please, just look." Emma stepped forward past the threshold he clearly expected her to respect and pointed at the clipboard sitting on the table beside his coffee. The same clipboard that held a printed summary of the exact numbers she'd found 2 days earlier. "Column 7 load distribution right there. You can check it yourself in 30 seconds. The 2 men in clean jackets exchanged a glance. Richard's jaw worked twice before he snatched the clipboard and scanned the page. And for a moment, one brief and terrible moment, Emma watched something shift behind his eyes. Recognition. He saw it. She knew he saw it because his hand went still on the paper, because the color in his face changed from red to something paler underneath. He set the clipboard down very carefully. "This is not your concern," he said. "People will be working under that column in 6 months," Emma said. "If it fails, it won't fail." His voice had gone flat, controlled the voice of a man choosing a story and committing to it regardless of what he'd just read. "The structural team signed off on this design." "Are you telling me you know more than a licensed engineering firm?" "I'm telling you the math is wrong. I can show you exactly where." "Get her out of here," Richard said to no one in particular, and one of the men in clean jackets rose from his chair more out of discomfort than obedience, unsure whether this was theater or crisis. Richard didn't wait for him. He crossed the trailer himself, took Emma by the shoulder and shoved her back through the door hard enough that she stumbled against the metal step outside, catching herself on the railing before she fell. Robert, watching from 20 yards off, took 1 step forward and then stopped himself, the old instinct winning again, the old fear of losing his own position outweighing whatever was rising in his chest. He shook his head slowly, not in disapproval of Emma, but in something closer to disbelief that she'd tried at all. "Pour it," Richard called through the open trailer door, his voice pitched loud enough for the crew to hear, loud enough to erase any doubt from the record. "East column now. We're behind schedule as it is." The trucks began to turn their drums toward the forms. Emma stood at the base of the trailer steps, dust settling on her shoulders, watching the gray concrete begin its slow pour into the framework that would soon become permanent, irreversible, buried beneath a tower that thousands of people would eventually walk beneath without knowing what she knew. She thought about screaming. She thought about grabbing the nearest worker and dragging him away from the pour line by force. She did neither, because she understood with a clarity that hurt more than any humiliation Richard could invent, that no one on this site would ever choose her word over his. The concrete kept coming thick and gray and final, filling the flawed frame 1 inch at a time. By midday, the pour was finished, smoothed, covered with tarps against the coming rain, already curing into something no apology could undo. Emma swept the yard around the new foundation in silence, her broom moving over ground that now hid a mistake only she and Richard fully understood, and she felt something harden in her chest to match it, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but sat close enough to both that she couldn't tell them apart. Richard didn't look at her again for the rest of the day. He didn't need to. He believed the matter was closed, filed away under the heading of nuisance rather than warning, and he had no idea standing there in his clean boots beside a foundation already sealing its own fate into the earth, that the paper he'd dismissed without a second glance was the only thing that could have kept his name out of a courtroom. Richard couldn't stop thinking about the trailer. Not the pour, not the schedule, not the investors who'd watched a sweeper walk in and point at his own clipboard like she owned the site. What stayed with him, needling under his skin for 3 straight days, was the certainty in her voice. He hadn't imagined that certainty. He'd seen it before in engineers twice her age with half her conviction, and something about seeing it in a woman who cleaned his floors made the whole thing unbearable. She knew. That was the problem now. Not the column, not the concrete already sealed into the earth, but the simple fact that Emma understood exactly what he'd buried under that tarp, and as long as she understood it, she remained a variable he hadn't accounted for. He decided standing at his trailer window that morning that the variable needed to disappear. The opportunity came easily enough. Emma had spent the better part of her shift clearing a storage corridor near the material shed, stacking loose piping into neat rows, sweeping the concrete clean of dust for the second inspection of the week. Richard waited until she'd moved further down the yard before he crossed to the shed himself, pulled 2 coils of expensive copper wiring from the locked cabinet, and tucked them behind a stack of pallets near the spot where Emma kept her cart. Jessica saw him do it. She was 31, the site's nurse stationed near the medical trailer for exactly this kind of quiet afternoon, and she happened to glance up from her paperwork at the wrong moment to see the right thing. Richard, wire in hand, glancing over his shoulder before he tucked it out of sight. She knew immediately what she'd witnessed. She also knew with the same immediate certainty that saying so out loud would end her position on this site within the hour. She looked back down at her paperwork. An hour later, Richard called the crew together near the material shed, his voice carrying the particular pitch of a man performing outrage rather than feeling it. "We're missing site materials," he announced. "Copper wiring, 2 full coils gone as of this morning." He let the silence stretch before he turned toward Emma. "You've been working this corridor all day." "I haven't touched the shed," Emma said. "I've been sweeping the—" "Check her cart." 2 laborers, uneasy but obedient, wheeled her cart toward the pallets Richard had already indicated, and there, wedged exactly where he'd left them, sat the coils of copper wire. A murmur moved through the small crowd that had gathered, half curiosity, half the particular hunger people get when someone else's disaster promises to be more interesting than their own shift. "I didn't put those there," Emma said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, though her hands had begun to tremble at her sides. "Someone else did." "Convenient," Richard said. "A theft. Discovered right where you've spent your entire day." Jessica stood near the medical trailer, close enough to hear every word, close enough to see the exact wire she'd watched Richard hide with his own hands now paraded in front of the crew as evidence of a crime that belonged to him. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. She thought of her son, of the rent due at the end of the month, of the dozen other women on other sites who'd lost their positions for far smaller acts of honesty than the one rising in her throat now. She closed her mouth again. "On your knees," Richard said to Emma, his voice pitched for the whole yard to hear. "Apologize to this crew for what you've cost this site." "I didn't take anything." "On your knees." Emma looked at the faces around her, at Robert standing frozen by the gate, at Jessica standing frozen by the trailer, at every person who had seen enough to know better and said nothing regardless. She thought about refusing outright. She thought about the wage she still needed, the hospital bill still climbing without mercy, the fact that a refusal here would end in something far worse than an apology. She knelt. "I'm sorry," she said, the words scraping out of her like something physical, something that cost more than pride to release. "I didn't take the wire, but I'm sorry." Richard smiled, thin and satisfied, the exact expression of a man who had gotten precisely what he wanted, without once considering what it had cost anyone else to give it to him. He turned and walked back toward his trailer, without another word, already certain the matter was closed, already certain no one on this site would ever say otherwise. The crew dispersed, slowly murmuring, glancing at Emma still kneeling in the dirt with her hands folded in her lap. Jessica finally moved, crossing halfway toward her before stopping herself, turning instead toward the medical trailer, her own guilt following her through the door like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Emma stayed on her knees a moment longer than she needed to, staring at the ground where the copper wire had sat, understanding with total clarity now that Richard hadn't accused her out of confusion or coincidence. He'd built this, piece by piece with his own hands, because he understood exactly what she knew and exactly how much it threatened him. She rose to her feet, brushed the dust from her knees, and picked her broom back up because there was nothing else to do, because the wage was still owed, because tomorrow the hospital bill would still be waiting, regardless of what indignity today had cost her. But something in her had shifted, quiet and immovable, the way ground shifts long before anyone notices the crack in the foundation above it. She did not know yet how far Richard intended to take this. She only knew with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest that whatever came next would not be the last time he tried to bury her beneath something that belonged entirely to him.
Hold on a second. He just forced an innocent girl to her knees to cover up his own deadly incompetence. If that were me, I would have exposed his error to the entire crew right then and there. Imagine being publicly humiliated and treated like a thief just for trying to save lives. This arrogance won't go unpunished.
The rain started sometime after noon and hadn't let up since, thin and cold, the kind that soaked through canvas jackets within minutes and left everyone on site moving with their shoulders hunched and their tempers short. Emma took her break where she always did, behind the concrete pipes, though today the shelter did little against the wind cutting sideways through the yard. She unwrapped her lunch with stiff fingers. It wasn't much, half a loaf, gone slightly stale, the only food she'd managed to buy after covering another partial payment toward her mother's hospital bill. She held it a moment before eating, grateful simply for its weight in her hands. Richard found her there. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stood over her, rain dripping from the brim of his hard hat, his expensive boots already ruined by the mud he clearly didn't care about ruining further. In his hand he held a rolled sheet of paper, and Emma recognized it before he even unrolled it, her own handwriting. The load calculations she'd sketched on scrap paper during a break 3 days earlier and foolishly left tucked inside her jacket pocket that morning. "Found this in the break room," Richard said. "Yours, I assume. Please give that back." He didn't. He tore it instead, slow and deliberate, into 4 pieces, then 8, letting the scraps fall into the mud at her feet like confetti from a parade no one wanted. Emma watched the numbers she'd worked so carefully to correct dissolve into gray water, and something in her chest cracked open at the sight of it, though she said nothing. "You think scraps of paper make you an engineer?" Richard said. "You think I don't see what you're doing? Undermining this site, spreading doubt to the crew, playing genius with a broom in your hand. I was only—" He kicked the mop bucket beside her before she could finish, sending a wave of filthy gray water directly across her lunch, soaking the bread through in an instant, ruining the only food she had until her next wage. Emma stared at it floating in the puddle, and for the first time in 3 long years on this site, something in her composure gave way entirely. She dropped to her knees in the mud without deciding to. "Please let me stay," she said, her voice breaking on every word. "I won't let you down. I'll stop. I'll never look at another blueprint again. I just need this job. Please. She reached out and gripped the toe of his shoe, an act of desperation rather than dignity, her fingers pressing into the leather he polished every morning like a religion. Richard looked down at her with something that wasn't quite disgust and wasn't quite satisfaction, but sat close enough to both that the difference hardly mattered. Robert stood at the gate, 20 yards off, close enough to see everything, close enough to hear her voice crack on, "Please." His hands tightened around the strap of his radio. He took one step forward. He stopped himself again, the old fear rising up exactly where it always did, and he hated himself in that instant more than he'd hated anything in years. "Get off me," Richard said, and kicked his foot free of her grip hard enough that she fell sideways into the mud. "You're done here," he said. "Pack your things. You're banned from this site permanently. If I see you near this gate again, I'll have security remove you. Please, get her out," Richard called toward the 2 guards stationed near the trailer, already turning his back before Emma could say another word, already certain the way he was always certain that this was the last he'd need to think about her. The guards were not gentle. They gripped her arms and walked her toward the gate at a pace that left her stumbling through the mud, her broken lunch left behind her, torn calculations dissolving somewhere in a puddle she'd never see again. Robert watched them pass without moving from his post, his jaw so tight it ached, his own silence a weight he would carry long after this moment ended. The gate closed behind her with a heavy metal clang. Emma stood on the wrong side of it now, soaked through mud, streaked up both arms, her stomach already hollow with the hunger of a meal she'd never get to eat. She looked back once at the sight through the chain link at the tower rising behind it with its buried, flawed foundation at the man inside who had just taken the only lifeline she had left. Her mother's hospital bill would go unpaid this week, possibly longer. She had no other job lined up, no savings to draw from. Nothing but the clothes on her back and a debt that grew heavier with every day she couldn't work. She turned and walked into the rain because there was nothing else left to do, because standing at the gate accomplished nothing beyond soaking her further. She believed walking away from the only wage she had that this was the very bottom of what her life could hold. She had no way of knowing yet that the bottom was still several days below her, or that the universe, indifferent as it had seemed through every hour of this cruelty, had already begun setting something in motion that Richard could never have imagined standing behind his gate in his ruined, expensive shoes. Emma didn't go home. She told herself that there was no reason to stand outside a gate that had just closed on her permanently, that the smart thing, the only sensible thing, was to walk away and figure out tomorrow's problems tomorrow. But her feet carried her back to the fence anyway, and she stood there in the freezing rain long after the last of the day shift had filed inside, gripping the cold iron bars with both hands, waiting for a reversal. She knew somewhere beneath, the hope was never going to come. Her stomach had stopped growling hours ago. It had moved past hunger into something duller, heavier, a low ache that made her lightheaded every time she shifted her weight. She hadn't eaten since the bread Richard ruined. She hadn't slept properly in days. She stood at the gate anyway because some small, stubborn part of her still believed that if she simply waited long enough, someone inside would remember she existed and decide she deserved better than this. Thomas found her there near dusk, ducking out through a side door with his collar turned up against the rain, and the sight of her at the fence pulled a grin across his face that had nothing kind in it. "Still here," he said. "Didn't Richard make himself clear enough for you?" "I'm not causing trouble," Emma said. "I'm just standing here." "You're an embarrassment standing here." He stepped closer to the fence, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath through the chain link. "Why don't you do everyone a favor and go die in a gutter somewhere? Nobody on this site is going to miss you." Emma said nothing. There was nothing left in her to spend on a response, no anger, no defense, just the cold settling deeper into her bones with every passing minute. Thomas laughed once, unsatisfied by her silence, and walked off toward the parking lot without waiting for a reaction that wasn't coming. Robert watched the exchange from his post near the trailer, and for the first time since this had all begun, he turned his face away entirely, unable to hold his own eyes on what his colleagues had become. Shame sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow or spit out. He didn't approach Thomas. He didn't approach Emma either. He simply looked at the ground and stayed there useless until the moment passed. The rain thickened as the evening wore on. No longer a drizzle, but a real downpour drumming against the corrugated roofs of the site trailers and turning the yard's dirt paths into shallow rivers. Emma's fingers had gone numb around the iron bars. Her clothes clung to her, soaked through to the skin, and every few minutes a violent shiver ran the length of her body before subsiding into a low, constant tremor she could no longer control. She thought of leaving a dozen times. She thought of her mother's hospital room, of the bill collectors who called twice a week now, of the fact that without this job she had no way to answer either. She thought, too, of the old beggar she'd fed her lunch to days earlier, of his strange, sharp eyes and stranger questions, and wondered in the dull haze of her exhaustion whether kindness had ever once in her life produced anything but more suffering to carry. Headlights swept across the fence around 8 o'clock. Richard's truck rolled toward the gate, polished and enormous against the flooded yard, and Emma straightened despite herself, some final ember of hope flaring in her chest that he might have reconsidered, that he might stop the truck and roll down the window and tell her this had all been some terrible mistake. He didn't slow down. He saw her at the fence. She was certain of it. His eyes flicking toward her for exactly 1 second as the truck approached the gate, and instead of easing off the gas, he pressed harder into it, swerving just enough to send a wide sheet of mud water directly across her body as he passed. Emma gasped and staggered back from the fence mud dripping from her hair, her face soaking into what remained of her already ruined clothes. The truck's taillights disappeared down the street without pause, without a single glance back. She sank down against the fence post, her legs no longer willing to hold her upright, and sat there in the flooding gutter with the rain pouring over her mud, drying stiff against her skin, her body shaking now from cold rather than fear. She had nothing left, no job, no food, no dry place to wait out the storm. No one on the other side of that fence willing to lift a hand on her behalf. She closed her eyes against the rain and let herself for just 1 moment stop fighting the exhaustion pressing down on every part of her. The cold rain masked whatever tears might have come. But somewhere beyond the flooded street, beyond the fence and the trailers and the tower rising unfinished into the dark, something had already begun moving toward her, slow and certain the way a storm gathers long before the first drop ever falls. The rain didn't let up. If anything, it worsened past midnight, coming down in heavy, wind-driven sheets that turned the alleyway beside the site into a shallow, moving river. Emma had stopped shivering in the violent way she had earlier. Now the tremors came slower, deeper, a kind of shaking that reached all the way into her bones and stayed there, and some distant, clinical part of her mind recognized what that meant even as the rest of her stopped caring. She had been sitting against the fence for hours. Her clothes had long since stopped being wet and started being simply cold, a second skin she couldn't shed. Her fingers, when she tried to move them, responded slowly, as if the signal from her brain had to travel through water to reach them. She thought distantly that she should stand. She thought distantly that standing required more than she had left to give. She thought of her mother's hospital room, its pale walls, its steady machines. She thought that at least her mother didn't know where she was tonight, didn't know her daughter had been reduced to a shape slumped against a chain-link fence in the freezing dark. There was a small, strange comfort in that. She let it settle over her like the only blanket she had left. Richard returned to the site near 1 in the morning. He hadn't planned to. He'd forgotten paperwork in his trailer, some contract he needed for a morning meeting, and the drive back had put him directly past the gate where he found her still there, still slumped against the post, barely distinguishable in the dark from a pile of discarded tarp. He stared at her a long moment through the windshield. Something in him, some small and buried thing, considered rolling down the window. He didn't. Instead, he parked, walked to the gate himself, and found Robert still on duty inside, hunched under the guard booth's narrow overhang. "She's still out there," Richard said, as if reporting a nuisance rather than a person. "Get her away from the property line. I don't want her collapsing where a camera can catch it." Robert hesitated. Sir, she's not moving much. Maybe we should call someone an ambulance or just move her down the block, Richard said. This isn't my problem. Robert stood there a moment longer, the rain running off the edge of his hood, every instinct in him screaming that this was wrong, that a man should not be asked to drag a half-conscious woman down a flooded street to protect a property line. He thought of his pension. He thought of the mortgage he still owed. He walked out into the rain anyway, because 30 years of practiced obedience proved stronger in the end than 30 years of quiet shame. He knelt beside Emma at the fence. "Come on," he said, his voice low, almost gentle, an apology folded inside the words he wasn't allowed to say instead. "I have to move you. I'm sorry." Emma's eyes opened part-way unfocused, and she didn't resist as he lifted her by the arms. She couldn't have resisted if she'd wanted to. Her body had gone past the point of fighting anything, and she let him half-carry, half-drag her down the flooded sidewalk toward the end of the block, her feet dragging useless trails through the water beneath her. Robert set her down against a low brick wall, a full block from the gate, out of sight of any camera, out of sight of anyone who might ask questions in the morning. He crouched there a moment, rain streaming down his face, and for one long breath he considered staying, considered calling for help despite what it might cost him. "I'm sorry," he said again, and walked back toward the site because that was in the end all he had ever been willing to give her. Emma lay against the wall in the flooding dark alone now, in a way she hadn't been all night. The cold had stopped feeling like cold. It felt instead like a kind of quiet spreading slow and total through her chest, and some small, clear part of her understood, without panic, without fear that her body was beginning to shut down around her. She stopped fighting it, her eyes closed. She thought, in the last clear moment, before the darkness folded over her completely, that she had tried. She had corrected the math. She had fed a starving stranger her only meal. She had knelt and apologized and begged, and none of it had been enough to earn her one more day of being treated like she mattered. She let that thought settle without bitterness, because bitterness required more strength than she had left to spend. The rain kept falling. The street stayed empty. Somewhere beneath the water, pooling around her, the last of her strength drained away with it. And just as her breathing slowed toward something dangerously shallow, just as the cold finished its work and the world narrowed down to almost nothing at all, a new sound reached her through the storm, distant at first, then closer, the low, heavy rumble of engines, more than one moving fast down the flooded street toward the exact spot where she lay. The engines grew louder before the headlights ever appeared. A low mechanical thunder rolling down the flooded street until 5 black SUVs rounded the corner in tight formation, their tires throwing up sheets of standing water as they braked hard outside the site gate. Doors opened before the vehicles had fully stopped. Richard heard them from inside the trailer and stepped out into the rain, still holding his forgotten contract, already arranging his face into the expression he used for investors, confident, welcoming, prepared to take credit for a project he'd nearly destroyed twice over. Thomas appeared beside him a moment later, smoothing his jacket, both of them certain that whatever this was, it belonged to men like them. "Gentlemen," Richard called out, striding toward the gate with his hand already extended. "I wasn't told to expect a visit tonight, but I'm more than happy to walk you through the..." The man stepping out of the lead vehicle didn't look at him. He was tall, dressed in a suit so precisely tailored it seemed to have no wrinkles at all, his face composed with the particular stillness of a man who had spent a lifetime deciding exactly how much of himself to show a room. Richard's hand hung in the air unshaken as the man walked straight past him toward the far end of the block, his security fanning out silently behind him. "Sir, if I could just..." The man didn't answer. He didn't slow down. Robert, standing frozen near the trailer, felt something drop through his chest as he watched the man round the corner toward the exact spot where he'd left Emma an hour earlier. He followed at a distance, unable to stop himself, unable to look away from what he already suspected was coming. The man in the suit knelt directly into the flooded gutter without hesitation, without a single glance at what the mud would do to fabric that had clearly cost more than Robert made in a month. He gathered Emma's limp form into his arms, checking for breath, for pulse, his composure cracking for the first time into something raw and urgent. "Medic," he said, and the word cut through the rain like a blade. "Now!" Two men rushed forward with a blanket and a case of equipment, working fast and practiced around Emma's still body, and Robert stood at the edge of it all with his jaw hanging open, unable to reconcile the ragged, starving beggar he remembered from the fence with the man now barking orders in a voice built for boardrooms rather than gutters. Emma's eyes fluttered open part way as the warmth of the blanket reached her skin. She saw a face above her familiar in a way her exhausted mind couldn't immediately place, sharp eyes she recognized even through the haze of hypothermia and hunger. She flinched instinctively, bracing for another cruelty, certain that whatever remained of this night could only bring more of the same. "You're safe," the man said, his voice low, steady, nothing at all like the wheezing rasp she remembered from the fence. "You're safe. No one is going to hurt you again." "Who?" her voice barely carried. "My name is William Hargrove," he said. "I own this site. I own the company building it. 3 days ago, you gave me your only meal without knowing that, and you answered a question about structural load that most of my licensed engineers would have gotten wrong." Emma stared at him, uncomprehending the words arriving slower than her mind could process them. Richard had followed at a distance, drawn by some magnetic horror he couldn't resist, and he stood now at the mouth of the alley, watching William lift Emma into his own arms to carry her toward the waiting vehicle. The smug confidence that had carried him through every cruelty of the past week drained visibly from his face, replaced by something pale and cold as the realization settled fully into place. "Sir," Richard called out, his voice cracking despite his best effort to steady it. "Mr. Hargrove, I had no idea, if you'll let me explain." William stopped. He turned Emma still cradled against his chest, rain running down both their faces, and looked at Richard with an expression that carried no anger at all, only a terrible, patient certainty. "You had 3 days," William said. 3 days since she warned you the east column was flawed. I have the audio from your own site meeting confirming you saw the numbers and chose to pour anyway." Richard's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "We'll speak tomorrow," William said. "At the site office. Bring your contract." He carried Emma to the nearest SUV without another glance backward, settling her carefully across the rear seat, as a medic wrapped a second blanket around her shoulders and pressed a warm cup into her shaking hands. Emma held the cup without drinking from it, her eyes fixed on William's face as he knelt beside the open door, and for the first time in 3 days, something in her chest loosened just slightly, cautious, disbelieving, but real. "Your math was correct," William said quietly so only she could hear. "Every figure. I checked it myself against the site's certified drawings this afternoon." Emma's eyes filled, not from the cold this time. "Then why did no one listen?" "They will now," William said. "I promise you that." Behind them, at the mouth of the alley, Richard stood frozen in the rain, watching the SUV's taillights disappear back toward the site gate, the polished confidence that had defined him for years, finally completely gone. By morning, the rain had stopped. Though the site remained a landscape of standing puddles and mud-slick paths, the storm's aftermath visible in every rutted tire track leading up to the gate. Emma arrived wrapped in a coat that wasn't hers, warm for the first time in days, seated beside William in the back of a car that smelled faintly of leather and nothing at all like the site she'd swept for 3 years. Richard was already waiting when they pulled through the gate. He stood near the trailer in a suit instead of his usual work jacket, as though formality might soften whatever was coming, his hands clasped in front of him, his face carrying none of the color it usually held. The entire crew had gathered without being asked to. Word had moved through the site overnight the way word always moves through places built on gossip and fear, and now dozens of laborers stood in loose clusters near the mixer, watching, in a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to have quieted out of respect for it. William stepped out of the car first, then offered his hand to help Emma down, and she stood on solid ground in front of the crew that had watched her humiliation for 3 straight days, her chin level, her eyes steady, no trace of the trembling girl who had knelt in the mud outside this same gate. "Mr. Hargrove," Richard began, his voice pitched for the crowd, already reaching for the only strategy he had left. "I want to be transparent with you. The structural concerns raised by this employee were never verified through proper channels. If there's an error in the foundation, the responsibility falls on the engineering firm, not on site management, and certainly not on my—" "Stop talking," William said. He reached into his coat and produced a single folded photograph, taken by one of his own security team the night of the storm, showing a hand-drawn equation pressed into wet dirt beside a fence post. He held it up for Richard, then turned it toward the crowd. "This is the load calculation for column 7, William said. "Drawn by hand in dirt, 3 days before your team poured concrete over a mistake she warned you about directly. I have the audio recording from your trailer confirming you read this same math on a printed page and ordered the pour anyway." A murmur moved through the crew, low and disbelieving. "That drawing," Richard said, "proves nothing. Anyone could—" "I compared it to the certified structural report myself," William said. "Every figure matches. She wasn't guessing. She was right, and you knew she was right, and you poured the foundation anyway because admitting an error from a woman with a broom cost more to your pride than it did to correct." Robert stood near the edge of the crowd, his throat tight, watching Richard's composure fracture piece by piece under the weight of every word. He thought of every moment he'd looked away, every silence he'd chosen over the smaller, harder choice of speaking up, and he stepped forward now, unable to stay quiet a second longer. "He knew," Robert said, his voice carrying further than he expected. "I watched him plant the missing wire himself. I should have said something days ago. I'm sorry I didn't." Jessica appeared at the edge of the trailer a moment later, drawn by the sound of Robert's voice, and added her own confirmation in a smaller, steadier tone, the fear that had kept her silent for days finally losing its grip in the light of morning. Richard looked between them, his mouth opening and closing without sound, the full weight of what he'd built finally settling onto him with nowhere left to hide. "You're finished here," William said. "Not just from this site, from every project I own, and I intend to make certain the licensing board hears about column 7 in detail." He reached out and pulled the foreman's jacket from Richard's shoulders himself, the tailored fabric he'd worn like armor for years, and let it fall into the mud at his feet. Then he crossed to Emma's discarded broom, still leaning against the trailer wall where she'd left it days earlier, and pressed the handle into Richard's hands. "Sweep," William said, "since you seemed so certain a broom was all she was fit to hold." Richard stood frozen for a long moment, the broom heavy and absurd in his grip, the entire crew watching in a silence that had shifted from disbelief into something closer to satisfaction. Then, because there was nothing else left for him to do, because every door on this site had just closed behind him, at once he bent and began to sweep the same dirt Emma had swept for 3 long years. William turned back to Emma and placed the master blueprints into her hands instead, the real ones corrected, now stamped with her name beside the title of lead architect. "This building is yours to finish," he said, "properly this time." Emma looked down at the pages, then out at the crew watching her, then finally at Richard bent over his broom in the mud where she had once knelt begging for a job that was never worth what it cost her. She felt no cruelty rise in her at the sight of it, no urge toward revenge beyond the simple quiet fact of standing there with the truth finally in her own hands. "Thank you," she said to William, her voice steady now in a way it hadn't been in years. "Thank her," William said, nodding toward the crowd. "When the foundation holds." Emma held the blueprints against her chest and walked toward the site office, no longer a sweeper, no longer invisible, the sound of her own broom scraping the dirt behind her, fading with every step she took toward the future she had already proven long before anyone believed her that she deserved.
The events in this story are a work of fiction, but the emotions are real. Our world is full of unrecognized genius and unrewarded sacrifices. I've often wondered if my own quiet acts of kindness go completely unnoticed in a harsh world. Would you have given your absolute last meal to a starving stranger in the freezing rain? Please share your thoughts below, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories.